The Security Plus exam goes through all kinds of different types of issues when it comes to wireless security. Now, I'm going to let Dan handle all the interesting, great demos for wireless security issues that are going to come into play. But as an introduction to wireless security, I want to do a quick overview of a history of wireless encryption standards. There have been a number of them. They are on the exam, but not so much. You're not going to be so much quizzed on these standards. It's more the ramifications of them. So let's go through starting at the very beginning. So at the very beginning, we had something called wireless equivalent privacy. And it was kind of like, sorry, Three Little Pigs, but to me it was like a house of straw. Wireless equivalent privacy, better known as WEP, was part of the original 802.11 standard. So we're talking around the year 2000, 2001, WEP came out with the first generation of wireless devices. WEP used RC4 streaming. It would begin with an initialization vector that would be based on your SSID passcode. We would then add this initialization vector and then we'd start encrypting. The downside to WEP is that there's nothing really wrong with RC4. The problem was the way the initialization vectors were created. It was easy for bad guys to be able to crack WEP. In fact, it was trivial for guys to be able to crack WEP. So by 2003, 2004, the powers to be of the 802.11 standards were like, oh my goodness, we've got big problems. We're going to throw away WEP and we're going to come up with a new standard. And this new standard was going to be based on something called 802.11i. So the original 802.11i standard basically said, forget WEP, we're going to come up with something new. And number one, instead of using RC4, we're going to use AES. And then number two, instead of just allowing people to use simple, easy to break initialization vectors and passcodes, we would use a much more complicated system called pre-shared key. And in fact, if you wanted to, you could go through a full-blown authentication system called Enterprise. And with Enterprise, you'd have a separate Radius server that have usernames and passwords and all that. Not too many people wanted to do that because Radius servers are $2,000 to $3,000. Not including configuration, and a lot of people didn't want to spend that money, especially for their coffee shops in their house. So they went ahead and said, we'll do this pre-shared key. However, there was a big problem with 802.11i. The big problem with 802.11i is most of the wireless access points and wireless network cards that existed back then couldn't handle AES. They couldn't handle it. So the Wi Fi people got together and said, okay. So instead of saying that we got 802.11i encryption, we're going to call it, you ready? Wi-Fi Protected Access, or WPA. WPA basically means we're still going to use RC4, but you can do the personal shared key, the Radius server. We still use RC4, but it's going to be harder to crack the RC4. And the nice part is if you do WPA, you can use older equipment that can't handle that AES. It didn't take too long after that. So by 2007, 2008, pretty much all the hardware out there, every wireless access point, every wireless NIC, and every laptop and smart device was strong enough to handle AES, and suddenly came up with something called WPA2, which I'm going to show as a house of bricks. WPA2 was the most popular encryption for wireless networks for well over a decade. And it's still very common out there. WPA2 uses AES encryption instead of RC4. However, it still has the Radius server, it still can do pre-shared key mode, all that's the same. The only difference between WPA and WPA2 is that WPA uses the old RC4 encryption, which, by the way, even though it's WPA and it's still using the RC4 encryption, it's greatly improved from the old WEP. So it's more secure than WEP, but with WPA2 you get full-blown, robust AES encryption. Not only do you get AES encryption, you also get a version of AES called Counter Mode Cipher Block Chaining Message Authentication Code Protocol, better known as Counter Mode, CBC-MAC, or just CCMP. Don't panic about that. Make sure you're aware that with a WPA2 network, remember it uses AES, this wouldn't work with WPA. Not only does it use the AES, but it uses that version of AES that stirs it up even a little bit better. It avoids pattern matching, things like that. So WPA2 has been around for a long time. It works great. The downside to WPA2 is that it can be cracked. In particular, WPA2 can be cracked through what's called a handshake. And we'll leave it to Dan to show you exactly how those types of cracks go on. But WPA2 definitely has had some problems over the years. So today what we see, it's a lot newer than WPA2, and it's still growing in terms of adoption, is WPA3. So if WPA2 was a brick house, WPA3 is a castle with lasers all over it. I mean, WPA3 is absolutely amazing. WPA3, number one, it disallows outdated protocols. So if you have a wireless access point that can do WPA3, it shouldn't be running WPA or WPA2 or anything like that. It should only do WPA3. There's some subtleties in there. The big thing though is that it has protected management frames. Keep in mind that if I've got a wireless access point, it's sending out what are called management frames all the time, and evil actors can use those against the system to break it. So with protected management frames, we definitely reduce one of the big issues with WPA2. The other big thing that WPA3 does is that it really doesn't do the PSK mode anymore. What it does instead is it does something called simultaneous authentication of equals, or SAE. Basically, it boils down to this, is that if you want to connect to another system and you're not using like a radius server or something like that, the simultaneous authentication of equals basically automatically encrypts any two connections between any two devices. And you don't have to do anything. You don't have to type in any passcode. It just connects. Now, is it as well encrypted as, say, running a full-blown radius server? There could be some arguments for it, but it's pretty intense stuff, and it definitely allows protection. If you can use WPA3, use it. It is absolutely incredible. In fact, when WPA3 started to become popular, it got me in trouble because all of my wireless cracking tools, which were designed for WPA2, stopped working. One of the challenges we run into with configuring wireless networks, particularly for home users, small office users, is they just don't have the sophistication of a more enterprise-based network where you bring in professionals to configure this stuff. So that's why years ago they came up with something called Wi Fi Protected Setup, or WPS. Wi Fi Protected Setup basically work like this. Now you have to have WPS capable wireless access points, and you have to have WPS capable devices. Let's say you have a laser printer, all right? So the idea with WPS is that you go over to your wireless access point, and there's invariably a button. You press a button, beep, you press the button. And you've got about 30 seconds to run over to your printer, and you press a button on the printer, and these buttons are marked. They say WPS. It's not hard to figure these things out. You press the button on the printer, and suddenly you would create a WPA2 encrypted connection between your laser printer and your wireless access point. WPS sounds great, doesn't it? The problem with WPS is the way the encryption's done, it is trivially cracked. Trivially cracked. In fact, WPS has reached the point where many home routers don't even include it anymore. And WPS is definitely going to be dropped as WPA3 becomes more and more predominant. Okay, the big takeaway from this episode is make sure you're comfortable with the 4 levels of wireless encryption: WEP, WPA, WPA2, and WPA3. And while we're in there, make sure you're aware that WPS is still out there in the wild a little bit, but it's something we want to avoid pretty much at all costs.